This is a private conversation that I need private. I need it to stay private for now.
From the outside, Aurora's life has always looked protected, sheltered, surrounded by adults who claimed they were guarding her heart, her peace, her future. Viewers saw a soft-spoken young woman who followed rules, respected authority, and stayed firmly within the emotional structure built around her. But beneath that surface, something far more complicated has been unfolding quietly for years, because Aurora is no longer a child. And loyalty, once simple, has become heavy. For much of her life, Aurora learned that belonging required alignment, that safety lived inside obedience, that love meant staying close, staying agreeable, staying within the lines drawn for her. She was praised for her gentleness, for her sensitivity, for her emotional openness. But as Aurora grew older, those same traits became pressure points. Every step forward felt like a step away from something. Every independent thought felt like a silent act of defiance. Every boundary felt like betrayal. And the conflict began slowly, so quietly that few noticed it at first. It started with body language, with hesitation before answering questions, with pauses where certainty used to live. Aurora didn't change overnight. She began reasoning. And for someone raised inside a tightly structured emotional world, thinking independently is not a neutral act, it's just disruptive. Because independence doesn't always arrive as loud rebellion. Sometimes it arrives as silence, as reflection, as emotional distance that isn't rejection, but reorientation. And that is where Aurora now stands, torn between the person she has always been expected to be and who she may be turning into. For years, Aurora's role in the family was clear. She was the loyal one, the sensitive one, the one who stayed close, the one who didn't challenge, the one who followed the emotional temperature set by others. That role brought her protection. It also brought her confinement. Because when loyalty becomes identity, stepping outside of it doesn't just feel risky, it feels impossible. But impossibility fades with age. As Aurora reached adulthood, her world widened. Exposure to different personalities, different expectations, different relational dynamics. Slowly, she saw that love doesn't always look like control, that closeness doesn't always require dependence, that safety doesn't always demand submission. Once that understanding begins to form, it cannot be undone. Yet Aurora didn't race toward independence. She demurred. Because the bond she carried wasn't shallow, it was deep, emotional, built over years of shared narratives, shared fears, shared identities. Loyalty wasn't just something she practiced, it wasn't something that she lived inside. And leaving that space, even partially, was like tearing at something fragile. Aurora's conflict is not dramatic on the surface. There is no public rebellion, no loud departure, no declaration of independence. There is instead something far quieter, internal negotiation. She measures every emotional step twice. She chooses her words with care. She considers not only what she wants, but how her wanting will be perceived. And that constant self-editing creates an invisible tension. Because the more a person edits themselves to preserve harmony, the farther they drift from their own truth. It is at that threshold now, where choosing herself feels like choosing against someone else. And that's one of the most difficult emotional places a young adult can be in. The family dynamic that shaped Aurora was built on emotional proximity, on the idea that closeness equals safety, that unity equals stability, that separation equals danger. Those messages were not spoken once, they were reinforced daily, through routines, through reactions, through emotional consequences. So when Aurora begins to feel the pull of independence, it doesn't feel like freedom. It feels risk, because she had never taught that love and distance could coexist. She was taught that distance always meant loss, and that conviction still resonates deep inside her decisions. There have been moments, small moments, where the shift becomes visible. A response that comes a little slower than before. A choice that doesn't mirror expectation. A silence where affirmation once came immediately. And every one of those moments counts. Not because they are dramatic, but because they are new. Aurora no longer responds automatically. She answers deliberately. And intention is the start of autonomy. Yet intention also invites scrutiny, because when someone who has always been compliant begins thinking for themselves, people notice. They sense it, they feel it, even when nothing is said. Aurora doesn't feel that awareness. She feels when the expectations shift. She feels it when concern hardens into control. She feels it when protection crosses the line into restriction. And navigating that emotional terrain requires a maturity that few people recognize she already holds. Her struggle is not loud, it is layered. She is grateful for the care she was given. She is also aware of the cost. She feels love. She also feels pressure. She feels loyalty. She also feels longing. Longing for space, for self-definition, to a life whereby her choices are not filtered through approval. And that longing grows stronger over time. But longing doesn't wipe out loyalty, it complicates it. Because Aurora doesn't want to break the ties that defined her. She wants to rename them. And redefining relationships inside a family system built on emotional intensity is never simple. Every shift feels seismic, even when it's quiet. Aurora is learning that independence does not arrive as a single decision. It arrives as a series of micro-choices. Where she stands emotionally, what she shares, what she withholds, what she accepts, what she questions. And those micro-choices are slowly reshaping her internal world. She doesn't buy into all these stories anymore. She no longer internalizing every fear as her own. She no longer measures her worth solely through proximity. These are subtle changes, but they are irreversible. Because once a person begins seeing themselves as separate, not disconnected, but separate, they can never fully return to emotional enmeshment. They can only renegotiate it. And it is in the renegotiation that conflict arises. Not because anyone fails, but because the systems resist evolution. Aurora stands at the threshold of that resistance. She feels this pushback in the form of concern, of emotional appeals. All force does not arrive as aggression. Some force arrives as fear. Fear that she will change too much. Fear that she will drift too far. Fear that she will no longer need the structure that wants to find her. And fear, when unspoken, often disguises itself as protection. Aurora senses that disguise. She feels when encouragement becomes redirection, when advice becomes influence, when closeness becomes containment, and each time she feels it, the line between loyalty and independence becomes sharper. She is not rejecting her family, she is remeasuring herself within it, and that recalibration is both painful and necessary. Because staying the same would require shrinking, and shrinking is not love, it is sacrifice of self. Aurora's emotional world is now stretched between two truths, one built on attachment, one built on selfhood, and both matter. That is what makes her position so fragile and so profound. She cannot run toward independence with grief. She cannot cling to loyalty with loss. So she moves carefully, step by step, breath by choice. And in that careful movement, a new version of Aurora is beginning to take shape. One who still cares, one who still loves, one who still values her roots, but who is no longer willing to disappear inside them. This is not a rebellion story. It is not a downfall story. It is a becoming story. And becoming is always quieter than destruction, but it is far more powerful. Because becoming does not erase the past, it reshapes the future. As Aurora's inner world continued shifting, the change began to ripple outward in ways no one could fully control. What had once been contained within hesitation and quiet reflection started appearing in her interactions, not loudly, not defiantly, but unmistakably. She began answering differently, not with the familiar softness of automatic agreement, but with thought, with pause, with a kind of careful honesty that made people lean in closer to hear what she was really saying. At first, those differences seemed small, a delayed response, a softened disagreement, a choice to stay quiet when she once would have reassured. But to a family accustomed to reading alignment as loyalty, even subtle changes feel enormous. Aurora no longer mirrored emotions automatically. She processed them. She no longer absorbed tension instinctively. She calculated it. And that internal evaluation began to change how she showed up. In conversations that once would have ended with her affirmation, she sometimes offered neutrality. In moments of expectation, she sometimes chose space. And with each instance, the lines she walked became thinner. Because loyalty in her world had never been passive. It was illustrative. It showed itself through emotional availability, through proximity, through affirmation, through choosing the same side without needing to be asked. So when Aurora's availability became more selective, the shift did not go unnoticed. Some interpreted it as growth, others interpreted it as withdrawal, and both translations had emotional resonance. She could feel when questions carried a different tone, when concern lingered a second too long, when encouragement felt slightly rehearsed, guided, not open. She knew when support became directional, and it made her cautious. Careful about what she was sharing, careful with what she let in, careful with what she needed, because needing something that existed outside of the familiar emotional structure felt dangerous. It introduced variables. Variations disturb control. And though no one accused Aurora of changing, she felt the unspoken monitoring began. The subtle checking, the emotional temperature taking, the sideways glances when she didn't react in predictable ways. She learned to read those cues quickly. Reading cues kept her suspended between the two versions of herself, the version shaped by expectation and the choice of the version emerging. Aurora's independence did not announce itself through action. It first appeared through thought, and thought is invisible until behavior shifts. At times, she would catch herself hesitating before choosing how to respond, not because she didn't know what she felt, but because she knew what the right answer was supposed to be. And the distance between what I feel and what I'm expected to feel began widening. It is that widening which allows the room for identity formation. But that space is lonely. It places a person between worlds, no longer fully contained by the old one, not yet fully rooted in the new one. Aurora remained in that liminal state for a very long time. She could still feel the pull of attachment, the gravity of relationships shaped by years of shared emotion, the comfort of being understood without explanation, the reassurance of being needed in familiar ways. But she could also feel the weight of that familiarity pressing inward. Not cruelly, wryly, because structures don't normally collapse under cruelty. They persist through repetition. And Aurora began to question repetition, not by confrontation, with curiosity. She wondered what it would feel like to choose without accounting for reaction, to speak without pre-editing, to want something without having to justify it through impact on others. She wondered whether freedom always felt like guilt at the beginning, if growth had always felt like a betrayal before it felt like freedom. And she wondered if loyalty could survive honesty. Those were not questions she asked aloud, but they shaped every choice she began making, even the tiny ones. She deliberated longer over decisions. She asked not just, "Is this right?" but "Is this mine?" She noticed when her body reacted with tension before her voice answered, because the body often knows its boundaries before the mind does. And Aurora was learning little by little to listen to those internal languages. The family, meanwhile, felt that it listened in distance, not dramatic distance, but unfamiliar distance, the kind that changes tone, the kind that alters rhythm, of the kind that would leave people wondering where they stand now. And uncertainty unnerves systems built upon emotional predictability. Once Aurora had been predictable. Her steadiness was reassuring. Now her consideration introduced pause, and pause invites interpretation. Some read it as maturity, some read it as doubt, some read it as resistance, but none of them fully saw it for what it truly was: reorientation. Aurora wasn't turning her back on her family. She was turning back upon herself. And self-orientation, after years of emotional alignment, feels like a seismic event, even if no one raises their voice. There were moments when the tension surfaced quietly. A suggestion was offered which she did not immediately accept. An expectation she did not immediately fulfill. A conversation in which she did not give any validation. None of these were confrontational, but taken together, they told a story. A story of one's induction into authorship of one's emotional life. And authorship changes everything. Because when someone becomes the author of their own choices, they are no longer merely the character others position them to be. Aurora was learning to narrate herself. But narration does not happen in isolation. It invites response. Some of those responses were warm, encouraging, grateful, particularly from those who recognized their own struggles reflected in hers. Some were cautious, wary, tinged with sadness, because when someone you love begins changing in ways you don't fully understand, it can feel loss, even if what is actually happening is growth. Aurora felt both sides of that response. She felt the relief when her independence was met with understanding, and she felt the ache when it was met by quiet disappointment. That pain kept her anchor, because it is a very strong anchor. But even anchors, over time, loosen. She began noticing how much emotional energy she spent managing reactions rather than exploring her own truth. How often she anticipated consequences before making simple choices. How deeply she had internalized responsibility for others' comfort. And that was a sobering realization, because early assumed responsibility provides durable impressions that shape one's identity. Aurora's sensitivity, once praised, had become a double-edged gift. It allowed her to read a room instantly, but it also made her acutely aware of the emotional ripple of every decision. And carrying that constant awareness made independence feel heavy rather than liberating. Yet not even heaviness can halt growth. It only can delay it. The change in Aurora did not explode. It accumulated. By default, through answered questions, through unsaid boundaries, through the moments she chose not to fill space with reassurance, through the times she allowed someone else's discomfort to exist without rushing to dissolve it. Those moments were small, but they were revolutionary. Because the moment a person allows discomfort to exist without immediately rescuing others from it, they reclaim a piece of themselves. Aurora was quietly doing that, pieces at a time. And with every recovered piece came a deeper sense of herself. She still loved deeply. She still cared. She still valued connection. But she wasn't willing to disappear anymore in order to preserve it. And that, more than any argument ever could, began reshaping how others related to her. They spoke more clearly. They asked more questions. They gave further explanations. Not because she insisted on them, but because her stillness invited them. An invitation sans force is an act of power. But power unused can be unsettling, because the system usually favors predictability over growth. And Aurora's growth was no longer invisible anymore. It had entered the relational space, not loudly, but unmistakably. She was still loyal, but loyalty now lived alongside selfhood. And balancing those two is one of the most complex emotional acts a person can attempt. Courage and patience are needed. Courage to continue, patience to let others catch up. Aurora was practicing both. Patience, however, has limits. Not only because when growth is delayed too long by fear of reaction, it risks stagnation. And Aurora began to feel that danger. She was being tugged by opportunity, of experiences not yet taken, of options yet to be tried, of adulthood not yet fully claimed. And those feelings made the middle ground between loyalty and independence increasingly narrow. She had spent much of her life protecting bonds. Now she was beginning slowly to protect herself, not by withdrawal, but through intention. And that intention would soon require something more than quiet change. It would eventually require clarity. And clarity, once voiced, changes relationships permanently. As Aurora's inner shift continued to deepen, it reached a point where quiet change could no longer remain invisible. The emotional adjustments she had been making privately began to surface in ways that affected the rhythm of the family itself. Not through confrontation, not through rebellion, but through difference. Difference in the way she moved through conversations. Difference in how she showed up emotionally. Difference in the amount of space she allowed herself to take up. For someone who had long been defined by proximity and emotional availability, even slight reductions in that availability felt noticeable. People sensed when she was no longer absorbing tension automatically. They felt it when she no longer rushed to smooth over awkward moments. They recognized it in the way she no longer filled silence with reassurance. And silence took on a different form. Before, silence had meant comfort. Now, silence signified distance. Not a cold distance, but one less familiar. That kind that makes people wonder where they stand. Aurora noticed the shift in others before they ever spoke it out loud. She saw it in the way conversations hesitated. She heard it in tone changes. She felt it in the subtle emotional recalibration that follows when someone no longer behaves the way you expect them to. And expectation is the currency with which emotional systems operate. If expectations change, so too must the system. But adjustment rarely occurs without resistance. Some family members responded with increased closeness, more questions, more check-ins, more invitations, not necessarily out of control, but out of fear. Fear that her distance meant she was slipping away. Others responded with emotional restraint. They mirrored what they perceived as her withdrawal with their own. Neither of the responses were malicious in nature. Both were protective. But protection can also be pressure. Because when someone begins stepping into themselves, loved ones often try to hold them closer, not realizing that closeness, if demanded, feels like containment. Acutely, Aurora felt that tension. She felt when closeness was offered freely and when it was used as a way to preserve the old dynamic. And she began distinguishing between the two. She knew when to lean in. She learned when to pause. She learned when connection felt mutual and when it felt obligatory. That learning sometimes came with much emotional pain. For once, obligation had been masquerading as love, and to recognize the difference was to reinterpret her whole emotional history. Not in bitterness, yet in clarity. And clarity is painful when it rearranges meaning. She really did sometimes question herself to the core. Was she being unfair? Was she changing too much? Was she being disloyal just by claiming a self? Those questions didn't come from accusation. They came from attachment, because attachment makes us doubt the right to change. Aurora's loyalty was not performative. It was woven into her identity. And disentangling identity from allegiance felt like erasing part of herself. But she was beginning to realize something quietly devastating. She could be loyal and still grow. She could still deeply love without being confined emotionally. But to love that way meant redefining love itself, not as fusion, but as choice. And choice brings in uncertainty, because once people realize something is chosen rather than guaranteed, they must confront the possibility that it might change. That confrontation unsettled parts of the family. They felt the emotional ground shifting beneath them, not because Aurora declared a new direction, but just because she stopped standing exactly where she always had. Some did this by attempting to reinstate the old balance. Others, however, started looking within themselves. They watched how Aurora held herself differently, how her voice carried less urgency, how her responses were slower but more grounded, how she seemed less reactive and more deliberate. They saw her become, and becoming reveals stagnation. That visibility created discomfort, not because growth is wrong, but because it reveals what hasn't moved. Aurora was no longer living solely in response to others. She was beginning to live in response to herself. That shift in the emotional equation for everyone was huge. Where once people approached her expecting affirmation, they now approached her with inquiry. Where once they had expected alignment, they now discovered difference. Where once they had expected reassurance, they now found reflection. Those changes shifted how conversation flowed, because conversations grounded on affirmation feel safe. Conversations based on reflection seem truthful. While harmony can be maintained, honesty is harder to maintain. There were moments when her reflection surfaced gently. Moments when she said, "I have to think about that." Times when she would say, "I'm not sure I see it that way." Times when she did not say anything whatsoever. Each time, the air was different. Not dramatically, but palpably. Because someone who once responded predictably had become unpredictable in the most important way. She began responding from self, not from script. The family was feeling it, and they didn't always know how to interpret it. Some perceived it as distance. Some saw it as maturity. Some felt it as loss. Some quietly admired the courage it took. Aurora felt all those interpretations moving around her like invisible currents. They shaped how she navigated interaction. They influenced when she spoke and when she remained quiet. They informed when she approached and when she stepped back. She was learning in real time how to exist between attachment and autonomy. And that is one of the most emotionally complex places a person can stand, because both pull with equal force. There were days when loyalty felt heavier than independence. Days when asserting herself triggered waves of guilt so strong she considered retreating back into the familiarity of old roles. And then there were days when independence felt heavier than loyalty. Days when suppressing her own voice felt unbearable. She oscillated between those two emotional weights, not to escape either one, but to understand both. And in that oscillation, her emotional intelligence sharpened. She became more aware of what she could carry and what she no longer should. She learned that emotional closeness doesn't require self-erasure. She learned that protecting others from discomfort often comes at the cost of protecting oneself from authenticity. And she learned that authenticity, once experienced, cannot be returned to silence. Her change was not aggressive. It was assertive in the quietest way. It was assertive because it honored truth without demanding agreement. And that kind of assertion changes relational power in ways that are impossible to ignore. She was no longer the emotional extension of the collective. She was an individual presence within it. That distinction quietly rearranged how people related to her. They spoke to her instead of through her. They included her instead of assuming her. They began asking instead of expecting. And though that shift took time to settle, it marked a significant evolution. Because asking someone instead of assuming reveals respect. Aurora didn't demand that respect. She elicited it through consistency, through calm, through emotional integrity. Yet with respect came space, and space introduces another kind of distance. Not alienation, but differentiation. The family began holding her with less immediacy, less reflex, less emotional dependence. Not in rejection, in recognition. They were beginning to see her not only as who she had been, but as who she was becoming. Still, this new positioning was not without strain. Relationships reshaped through quiet evolution often ache before they stabilize, because what once felt known becomes ambiguous, and ambiguity can be unsettling. Aurora's felt that unsettlement in long looks, in quieter conversations, in the pauses before responses. But she did not retreat, because retreat would have meant returning to certainty at the cost of truth. And she had already tasted what it meant to speak from self. She could not give that up. She began to understand something essential, that loyalty rooted in fear will eventually fracture, but loyalty rooted in choice can transform. She was not abandoning loyalty. She was transforming it, from obligation to consent, from pressure to consent, from reflex to decision. And that transformation, though gentle, was irreversible. The family would have to adjust, not because she demanded change, but because she had already changed. And change, once embodied, reshapes every space it enters. Aurora was no longer only the loyal daughter. She was becoming a woman with a voice. And voices, once found, ask to be heard, even when they speak softly. By the time Aurora's quiet transformation reached this stage, the family no longer experienced her change as subtle. It had become a living presence in every interaction, not confrontational, not disruptive in the way arguments are, but disruptive in the way truth always is, because the truth doesn't need to shout to rearrange a room. Aurora was no longer positioning herself instinctively in relation to others. She was beginning to position herself in relation to her own inner compass. That shift alone altered the emotional geometry of every relationship she moved through. She still showed up. She still listened. She still cared, but she no longer disappeared inside other people's needs. And that difference came in ways that no person could fully foresee. At family gatherings, her energy was noticeably different. She wasn't scanning the room for emotional turbulence. She wasn't preparing herself to intervene or soothe. She wasn't bracing for volatility. She was present without armor. And presence without armor feels different to people who are used to defensive postures. Some found relief in that presence. Others were disturbed. Because armor creates familiarity, even when it causes pain. Aurora was no longer wearing the emotional armor of compliance. She was learning to exist without pre-negotiating her own reactions, and that made her both freer and more vulnerable. There are moments when loved ones lean in with interest. They inquired how she did, but not for performance. They noticed her shift. They listened to it without prejudgment. All those moments nailed it. But then, too, there are instances when concern shades into pressure, when concern masqueraded as redirection, when advice whispered the quiet message, "Come back to who you were." Those were the moments that tested her courage, because telling someone you are not who you were anymore doesn't require confrontation. It requires unwavering consistency. Aurora practiced consistency in gentle ways. She didn't defend her boundaries with speeches. She repeated them for defense. Each time she chose not to over-explain. Each time she opted not to rush reassurance. Every time she decided not to hold on to guilt that was never hers. Boundaries that get repeatedly created become believable. And as her boundaries became more believable, the family was forced to reckon with something they had never faced before. Aurora did not need their approval anymore for emotional reasons. That realization, quietly but forever, changed the dynamics of their relationship. Approval had once been the central currency of belonging. Now, Aurora belonged to nobody first. To belong to oneself changes every relational equation. Some relationships adapted. They became more mutual, more transparent, less performative. Others strained, because what had once been sustained by proximity now required personal accountability. But accountability is seldom welcomed. Aurora felt the difference in the texture of conversations, in the delays between messages, in the way certain topics were avoided entirely. Not out of anger, out of uncertainty, people learned how to relate to her new self. And learning takes time, but time alone doesn't guarantee acceptance. It only creates space for possibility. Aurora walked through that space slowly, not with a sense of entitlement, with humility. She didn't assume her growth entitled her to immediate understanding. She allowed people to stumble in their adjustment because she deeply knew one thing: they were not losing her. They were losing a version of her that had existed for their comfort. And loss, even necessary loss, grieves. She made space for that grief, but she didn't carry it for them. That distinction mattered. It meant the difference between compassion and self-erasure. Sometimes it got thick with emotional tension. There were days when she felt the weight of unspoken expectation pressing in from all sides. On those days, choosing herself felt like an act of quiet rebellion, even though it wasn't meant that way. But over time, Aurora picked up on something. Rebellion seeks to destroy the old. Transformation simply grows beyond it. And she was not trying to destroy anything. She was trying to grow. As that growth continued, it confronted one of the deepest fears embedded in loyalty-based family systems, a fear that independence equates to abandonment. That fear came out in subtle ways, through increased concern, through overprotection, through emotional appeals framed as care. Are you okay? Assumed shades of meaning. Are you sure? Carried more than one question. And Aurora learned to hear those layers without being consumed by them. She replied with steadiness and without over-justification. Yeah, I'm fine. Yes, I'm sure. No, I'm not leaving. But yes, I am changing. That was reassuring, yet challenging too. Because reassuring others while continuing to evolve requires tremendous emotional discipline. She was developing that discipline in real time. There were moments when she felt loneliness rise unexpectedly, not because she lacked connection, but because moving into a new version of yourself often means walking through spaces where fewer people can accompany you. She still loved her family. She just no longer needed to mirror herself to stay inside. That difference created emotional stretches that felt both liberating and isolating. Liberating because she was finally in herself. Isolating because not everyone knew how to meet her there yet. But isolation did not mean abandonment. It was transition. Aurora learned to tolerate that in-between space, a space where the sense of belonging is quiet, not fused, where love is, but no eternal need for reassurance. That space in which presence doesn't demand emotional surrender. That space is where adulthood begins. The family dynamic, however, was still learning that lesson. Some of them showed maturity in their responses. Others struggled. Because when a system is built on emotional entanglement, differentiation feels like unraveling. However, unraveling sometimes is the only path to reweaving with intention. Differentiation was not explosive in Aurora. It was surgical. It removed what no longer served her without tearing apart what still did. That kind of change is rare. It takes patience that borders on endurance. And endurance is one of the most active kinds of strength. And then, gradually, something extraordinary started to occur. The emotional pressure around Aurora started to subside, not because she appeased expectation, but because her consistency retrained the system. People began to realize that her independence was not some passing phase. It was an attitude. And postures, when stabilized, become dependable. They learned that she would not collapse into old roles just to preserve comfort. They learned that her love did not waver when boundaries appeared. They learned that her presence did not disappear when she said no. And once those truths settled, something shifted. The tension eased, not dramatically, but palpably. Relationships recalibrated, not to the old dynamic, but instead to a new one in which Aurora was involved but not consumed, caring without being container, bound together, not held hostage. That recalibration did not remove every ache, but it removed the constant negotiation, and that allowed authenticity to breathe. Aurora would not have to prove her loyalty through sacrifice anymore. Her loyalty existed because she chose it, not because she was required to perform it. That decision changed the qualitative feel of her relationships. Some relationships deepened through mutual respect. The rest became quieter by readjusting together. Both findings were honest, and honesty, though often not comforting, is always stabilizing. But beneath all of that, one question still loomed. Was this new form ever going to get fully accepted by the family? Or would they continue, quietly hoping she would revert back? The question kept screening like an unresolved chord in every interaction, and it would shape the final stage of her transformation, because growth can adapt, but it cannot reverse. Aurora had crossed too many internal thresholds to return to emotional enclosure. She had recognized her right to choose, and that recognition is permanent. What remained uncertain was how the family would finally respond to a woman who no longer lived solely inside the role they once understood. Because at some point, quiet change always asks for public acknowledgement, not in words, in behavior. And that moment was approaching. There is that one moment in every long internal struggle when the question ceases to be, who do they need me to be, and finally turns into, who can I afford to become? For Aurora, that moment came as a quiet, realized clarity in the depth of her bones, rather than as some sort of showdown. Not all realizations are loud. Some arrive as calm. Aurora no longer felt tugged in all directions at once. The constant tug between loyalty and independence began to organize into something steadier. She didn't need to proclaim her boundaries anymore. They simply existed. And because they existed without apology, the family had to respond to them. Some responded with respect they hadn't known how to give before. They adjusted their expectations. They learned how to relate to Aurora as an individual rather than an extension of a role. The conversations shifted, the dynamics softened. The emotional pressure that once hovered between every exchange began to thin out. Others struggled longer, not with anger, with grief. Because when someone steps out of who they used to be, it can feel like losing them, especially if you loved that earlier version fiercely, even when the change is healthy, even when it is necessary, even when it leads to greater peace. It doesn't always mean rejection. Sometimes it simply means transition. Aurora realized this now in a way that she hadn't before. She made space for that discomfort. She didn't insist on instantaneous adjustment. She didn't discipline hesitation with withdrawal. She remained steady. And steadiness created trust. Eventually, the emotional negotiations quieted, not because everyone felt perfectly resolved, but because the old dynamic no longer applied. It slowly became clear that Aurora's independence was not temporary. It was integrated. She was not testing distance. She was living it with intention. She was not questioning loyalty. She was redefining it. Loyalty no longer means anything emotional. It meant honesty. That meant showing up without pretenses. It meant caring without collapsing. It meant connectivity that didn't require self-sacrifice. And when loyalty changed shape like that, relationships had no choice but to change with it. The family was no longer waiting for Aurora to reassume the old position. They began relating to who she actually was. Not all at once, not perfectly, but serious. There were moments when the new dynamic felt lighter than anyone expected. Conversations without tension, choices without anxiety, space without fear. The family began seeing that independence hadn't taken Aurora away from them. It had merely brought her closer to herself. And when someone is closer to themselves, their presence carries a different tone. It carries sincerity. It carries stability. It carries less performance and more truthfulness. The emotional atmosphere surrounding Aurora became quieter, not out of distance, but out of ease. Interactions lost their sharp edges. Expectations softened. The constant emotional scanning that once defined every moment no longer dominated her exchanges. She could, at least. And being without bracing for reaction is a form of freedom few people ever experience inside loyalty-bound systems. Aurora's change didn't, in the end, break love. It matured it. Because love that survives independence is no longer based on fear. It's rooted in choice. The family began honoring her choices not because they fully understood them, but because they saw the peace those choices created. They saw the steadiness, the groundedness. They saw that the anxious version of Aurora, the one who constantly negotiated her place, was giving way to someone calmer, clearer, and more self-directed. And that change was undeniable. The emotional history didn't get erased. It didn't rewrite the past. It didn't reverse the years of attachment that had defined her. But it reframed what attachment meant going forward. Aurora learned that she didn't have to choose between loyalty and independence. She learned she could hold both, if she was willing to let them coexist without forcing one to dominate the other. That balance is fragile, but it is also powerful. Because balance doesn't need to win. It requires presence. And presence became Aurora's defining quality. She no longer moved through family space as someone seeking permission. She moved through it as someone offering authenticity. She no longer measured herself exclusively through emotional response. She measured herself through alignment with her own values. She still loved deeply, but no longer did she love at the expense of self. And that distinction changed everything. The version of Aurora that once felt caught had now become centered. Not hardened, not detached, but grounded. Her independence did not alienate the family. It gave a new relation for the family towards her. One based on mutual respect, not emotional obligation. The transformation didn't come with a single defining moment. There was no speech, no rupture, no turning point that could be marked on a calendar. It arrived the way most real growth does. Gradually, quietly, inevitably. Aurora had crossed the line between fitting in and being real. And once authenticity takes hold, it no longer asks for permission. It just is. The family learned slowly that they could not keep expecting the loyal child without accepting the autonomous woman. They could not preserve the old comfort without honoring the new boundaries. They could not keep loving her for who she was without learning to love her for who she had become. And that learning reshaped the emotional future of every relationship around her. For the fact that Aurora did not travel alone. Her independence modeled possibility for others too. It showed that growth could occur without rejection, that space could exist without abandonment, that change could arrive without cruelty. This reshaped what loyalty looked like, not just for her, but for everyone watching. And that's what made her journey so powerful. Not because it was loud, but because it was true. Aurora has not escaped her past. She incorporated it. She didn't sever her history. She matured within it. She didn't reject loyalty. She transformed it. And now, standing fully within her own emotional agency, she no longer exists between two worlds. She inhabits one. A world where love is chosen, where boundaries are respected, where independence is not betrayal, where loyalty is not detention. A world where she can be both connected and integral. And that's the real resolution of her journey. Not separation, not rebellion, but self-possession. Aurora is no longer torn between loyalty and independence. She carries both. And in carrying both, she steps forward not as the role she once played, but as the woman she has become.